Let's look at the overview of the 10 functions or knowledge areas of project management. And it all starts with project scope management. See, there's two types of scope. The first scope is called product scope. Product scope is where actually all the headaches start if you don't get them clear enough. Because these are the outputs, these are the deliverables that the project is creating. For example, you can't just say we're going to give you a report because that's managing no expectations. But if you were to give a report, you'd state things like a report that includes, and you'd put dot points. That enough allows the management of expectations of the project sponsor to make sure the report's got what they want in it. But imagine just saying marketing brochure. Again, that's not going to be good enough, and I certainly couldn't go and get a quote just telling the printer that I want to have a marketing brochure. I'd at least have to have some content around it, such as 1,000 A4 double-sided colour trifold on this type of paper. Now remember, when you've got that clarity, you're then managing the expectations of the stakeholders. The second type of scope is called process or project scope, and that's all the work I have to do to create those deliverables. If I was creating a new prototype car, for example, all the manufacturing and fabrication processes that put that car together would be included in the process or project scope. So therefore, it's actually defining the work that has to occur. And we use a tool called a work breakdown structure. But of course, not only looking at what's in scope, which is that both that product and that process scope, but also what is outer scope. See, outer scope is otherwise known as exclusions. And it's very important to state exclusions because you're giving more clarity on what you're getting and what you're not getting. Now, I always remember being a scuba diver, there was a friend of mine that had a dive boat and they were getting it custom made. But the problem with it is it was running late. The project was running late. So when they went to pick up the boat, at their absolute dismay, the boat did not include engines. And when you look at it, the owner said, where the hell's my engines? Anyone knows if you have a boat, you needed the engines. And the person explained that even though they were listed in the specifications of the boat that explained what type of engines it would have, the engines were not part of the deal he bought in terms of the fabrication of the boat. Now that meant that you had a very unhappy project sponsor. So when you look at that, getting clear on what's not included up front allows you then to state and manage your expectations with certainty. The second one we're going to look at is going towards time, but I want to talk about the work breakdown structure in more detail. Because in time management, this is where we have to work out each of the tasks that are involved, then to start working out on how long they take. Now, the work breakdown structure example would be a report. You've already defined what the report is and what it's going to include. Now we've got to look at the process scope that defines exactly what is in it. For example, you'll have an activity called a report, and then we've got to state all the tasks that are involved in creating that report. For example, you might be researching other models and you might be researching the market needs as two different tasks. And then of course you've got the draft, the review, the update, approve, and ultimately the publication of that report. Now, activities are stated in noun or they're a name of a deliverable, like this example with the report. Whereas tasks are verbs and should be written as doing things, because you can have activities and sub-activities and tasks and subtasks. But basically the task is the doing thing. Now when we put it on a work breakdown structure, we can then look at the effort or the elapsed time of each of those tasks. And then when you add them up, you get an idea of how long the project's going to go for. For example, we might see that this example says 8 weeks, but the question is it really 8 weeks? Because we might find it's 7. Let me give you an example why. When we start looking at the dependencies on each of these tasks, you'll see, for example, that I could have done the reports, the research components, at the same time in parallel. We call that fast tracking. Once you've got those, you can see task 1.1 and 1.2 must be done before it goes to 1.3. Therefore, task 1.3 is dependent on both task 1.1 and 1.2 being done. Now, when they have been done and we write that up, a Gantt chart can be created. Now, the Gantt chart then shows that instead of it being an 8-week task, it can be reduced down to only 7 weeks. And that is because the Gantt chart shows the shortest duration, which is otherwise known as the critical path. Now, when we look at this critical path, you can then see that task 1.1 and 1.2 were running at the same time. And the software will always default them to start at the very same time. And the gap in terms of the first one being for a 2-week duration compared to the second one being only a week, that allowed us to have what's known as float or slack at the end of task 1.2. Now that means if we're running late on that task, we could therefore still not impact the final schedule. But task 1.1 must be done before 1.3, 1.4, etc. So if I was running late on 1.1, the whole project schedule is going to be out. But wherever I've got a task with some float at the end, if I'm running late and it's within the time span of the float, I will still not impact the ultimate schedule of the project. That's why when things are going wrong, the project manager is most interested in the critical path tasks, because those ones with float we can move around. And the trick is to leave as much float as possible at the end of the task, just in case we have those delays. Why do we move them? Well, that's clear in when we need to allocate human resources. For example, if we had 2 tasks starting at the same time, but you wanted John to be on the first one for 2 days and then move down to this and start the second one on day 3, you would then move it along. So instead of starting it on day 1, you would actually start it on day 3. And of course, if you've left some float behind at the end, if it is running late, still not going to impact the final schedule. The work breakdown structure itself has 3 different types of work breakdown structures. The first one is called deliverable based. And what we're talking about here is defining the activities for the grouping of the tasks. See, the activity doesn't mean anything other than allows us to better understand the structure of the task we're producing. For example, the report was a deliverable based. But if you were going to build a construction site, you might have building, car park, swimming pool, and those activities are the deliverables themselves. And then we have the tasks under each that then explain the whole process in creating those deliverables. The second type is known as process-based. And again, these activity structures are based on how we best think. So in terms of a research project, it might be better as a process-based work breakdown structure because the activities might be better stated as design it, build it, test it, commission it, for example, and it is much better for us to understand it in terms of a process. The third type is called functional-based work breakdown structure, and that is where we're allocating it to a particular function. For example, take an event. We may have certain tasks under security, certain tasks under ticketing, certain tasks under the different functions such as catering. And in that way, the work breakdown structure can be cut and pasted to that particular function or the person doing it. So when you're creating a work breakdown structure, you must first think about how best to set out those activities. Because if you've got the activities right, then it's easier to write up the tasks. However, if you find that you're having major difficulty trying to create the work breakdown structure, that just tells us that you haven't defined the deliverables good enough. Go back and get it absolutely clear on what the deliverables are, then the work breakdown structure becomes far easier to do. The next part is looking at cost management. See, the work breakdown structure for each task item, we can then allocate it a cost. In fact, we can allocate the cost of human resources, both internal and external, internal meaning staff, external meaning contractors or suppliers, but also equipment, materials and consumables. So you've effectively got the human resources and the other. Now, when you add all those up on the work breakdown structure, that's referred to as direct costs because they needed to happen because they were directly relating to a task in the project. However, there's a lot more cost in running a project. For example, when someone rings you and your project team up, they often go through the receptionist, and someone must be contributing to the cost of the receptionist. Of course, the payroll officer, we all want to get paid, so therefore someone must be contributing to those support functions that we don't see doing a task in a project, but are very important supporting the task. That includes the building you may be given and operating out of, and even the laptop that your organisation has given you as a part of your tool as a staff member. All those contribute to costs, but we call them indirect cost, or otherwise known as overheads. So therefore we get the direct cost from the work breakdown structure, and then we add a percentage, often referred to as 10% administration. So we get the direct costs plus the indirect cost. That gives us our total project cost. And of course, if it's an internal project, you might find people are calling that a project budget. But if you're working for someone else, we can't work for free. So what we do is we add a markup, which is referred to as a margin. And that percentage will be based on how much money we want to make from the job. So when you look at that markup or margin, if I was a private company, I'd refer to it as a profit margin. If I was a not-for-profit or a government, I would just refer to it as a margin. But we still have to have a margin when we're working for someone else. Because just think of the time that you're putting in a tender. It's even before the project is really kicked off and you haven't got any money for that. So where does those types of things get paid from? That's because when we're running projects, we're collecting margins. And the last part of that is when you then add the margin, that gives us our total project budget. So in summary, internal projects, the cost, the direct cost and indirect costs will be the project budget. But if it's for a project for someone else, you'll add a margin and then you'll refer to that as the project budget. Now, in addition to that, there will be another fund often put aside called a contingency fund or some form of reserve. Now, that is not given to the project manager, but it is kept separately and held by the project sponsor, only to be given out when the conditions of meeting that contingency are met. For example, we might be digging a dam. Now, what they do when they go out to dig a dam, they drill holes in the earth and they pull out the earth, which they call core samples, to work out what materials and minerals are in the ground. Is there any hard rock or limestone, for example? And if they do these drill holes, these core samples, and find that there is no hard rock or limestone, then they will pitch the project to be a certain schedule and a certain cost based on digging that type of ground. But they might then say, just in case we've got the core samples and we've gone around the hard rock, if we start digging here and we find hard rock, project sponsor, you should have a contingency held aside for the event that we do find hard rock, and therefore we have to bring in heavier gear, more people, and it will take longer. So that's a form of reserve or a contingency, which when you look at it, it's a risk management process. Now let's look at the next one. We're looking at quality management. See, quality management has two aspects of it. The first one I'm going to talk about is the 3 Ps. Because when you look at it, there's process. And that's why ISO accreditation and all those types of things, and why McDonald's is often ranked as one of the top quality companies in the world, is because their process is consistent. The second one is the actual product. And going back to the McDonald's example, that is the hamburger. So it's the quality of the output or the deliverable. And the third P is actually people. It's having quality people, people that will manage their professional responsibility, people that have the right qualifications, permits, licenses, etc. So those 3 Ps are very important when you look at the perspective of quality: the process, the product, and the people. But from a project management perspective, we talk about 3 things that come up in the quality management plan, and they are tests, inspections, and audits. These tend to be tasks embedded into the work breakdown structure, but we must have already set out the criteria and the standards that those tests, inspections, and audits are required to meet. But what is the main difference between an inspection and an audit? Well, here's how it works. An inspection is undertaken by the team member themselves, but an audit is taken by someone outside the team, a third party, that is coming into the project and doing a comparison. So if I was going for ISO 9001 accreditation, my team may have put in that project, they may have been inspecting it to make sure it was prepared for the audit, and then the auditor came in, and the auditor will then be that third party, that independent check. Now let's look at human resources. Because human resources is actually trying to identify, do we have the right people? Do we have the right competency? How many do we want? When do we want them? And when you look at it, there's 4 core things we must be considering. Firstly, what are the individual's industry knowledge? What is their organisational knowledge? What is their actual competency or skill level? And lastly, what is their individual and collective as a team talents? And human resources goes about looking at who are they, what is their skill, how do we recruit them, how do we induct them, and how do we manage their performance during the project. So all those aspects come up under human resources, which effectively is the project team themselves. Moving on to communications management. Now, communications management is absolutely critical because it really sets out the protocols, the information flows, and document management, including version control. One of the key tools we have is the communications management plan, and that sets out to look at the key stakeholders, meaning who are the key people we're engaging with. A stakeholder is involved or input or impacted by a project, whereas a key stakeholder has the ability to influence it. For example, the project manager is a key stakeholder, the project sponsor is a key stakeholder. In fact, the project team are all key stakeholders because if they don't do their job, the project gets impacted. But I might have other key stakeholders like the media or community groups, etc. So the communications management plan looks at who the key stakeholders are, what information do they want, in what format do they want, and when they want it, which is the frequency, and it defines the responsible officer doing those communications. But it's more about that protocol. It's more about what information is being conveyed and in what format. Now, stakeholder management used to be part of communication management, but it's actually being held separately because it's now focusing on the engagement of those key stakeholders. And if you look at an organisational chart as an introduction to a project, you'll see that the project sponsor is the person we're working for. They're the executive. They're the ones that sits at the top that the project manager is effectively reporting to. The project sponsor has the ability to approve the use of resources, but also the ability to cancel the project. In fact, if you think you've got the wrong person, a little trick we can use is we can ask, if this project gets cancelled, will you have the ability to make that decision? If they say yes, they're clearly the project sponsor. Otherwise, they will refer to someone else and that will indicate who the real project sponsor is. Below the project sponsor, you actually have and can have a steering committee. Not always, but it's a choice that you can have if you deem it to be worthwhile. And in fact, we don't necessarily want a steering committee, but in the event that the project is highly political, where we need to bring in the political powers of key people with influence, you would actually have one. If it was a project across the whole organisation, and therefore you want a representative of each of the directorates, or if it was national, each of the states, or if it was international, each of the countries, that would be a good use of having a steering committee. Or the third one, if it's a joint venture, because arguably we say, what happens if there needs to be more than one project sponsor? Well, the answer is you can't break that rule. There only can be one person as a project sponsor. But if you've got a joint venture and you're bringing two parties together, they may both want to be involved in the decision making. And in that case, we put them into a steering committee and we allocate the project sponsor to the chair role. That way, we're bringing back the rules as one project sponsor. So in summary, we have that one project sponsor who is an individual. The term client is the organisation that they are representing. You then can have the steering committee, and that's when the project manager comes in. Now, the project manager is the responsible officer for the project. The butt stops there. But they can be allocated for task completion to team members. So there's no restriction to the number of team members I can actually have. But I want to just lastly point out another group that you may find in a project, and it can be multiple groups, which we put under a name called advisory group. Now, advisory group is where a group of people or individuals brought together, whether it's for a particular technical purpose or a theme or something, but they're brought together to provide input, feedback and guidance to the project team. But here's the important thing. They're not like the steering committee, because the steering committee is an advisory to the project sponsor, and therefore they're going to have undue pressure on the project sponsor. Whereas you can see from that chart, the advisory group comes under the project manager, providing input, feedback and guidance to the project team, all of which we don't actually have to do anything about. So when you look at it, sometimes we have advisory groups purely for the political reason. You might have a technical group, you might have a cultural group. But at the end of the day, you don't need to have them. But if you do have them, remember, keep the numbers short, because every time you're dealing with one, that's another overhead. And then we look at risk management. See, risk management, there is an ISO standard, 31500, 2009, and that ISO standard basically sets out that we have to look at a context to the risk environment we're working at. For example, if you were building a building in your country compared to building a building, the same building, in a war-torn zone, the context of the risk has totally changed. Once we've got the context, we then have to look at the risk events themselves. And once we've got those risk events, we analyse them. We look at the likelihood of them happening, which is otherwise known as probability. Then we look at the consequence or impact of them happening, and that gives us a risk factor or a risk rating. The rule is, if it's high or extreme, we need a treatment strategy in place. And once you put this treatment strategy in place and you put this into what's known as a risk management plan, we also have to identify the responsible officer that is make sure that that treatment is being put in place and it's monitoring and controlling. Now, the next area is procurement management. Now, procurement management has three components to it. Firstly, anything to do with supply. So if you're thinking about purchase orders or getting quotes, basically purchasing, transporting, storing, allocating, and all those aspects of moving, transporting, all those come under supply, which is a part of procurement management. It also has asset management, because in a lot of cases, projects are creating assets, and therefore when we hand them over to the project sponsor at the end, we also have to consider all the warranties and guarantees that go with it. Sometimes we're buying it on their behalf and then we have to put it on our asset register because law says we have to report on certain assets of a certain value, and then we have to get it off our asset register and onto theirs at the handover stage. The third and final component of procurement management is contracts, and that means including all contracts around engaging with people. So when you look at it, supply, asset management and contracts is all key part of procurement management. And of course, this integration management, the glue, the piece that brings everything together. If the other 9 knowledge areas were bricks, the integration management represents the cement that explains that if you mess around with one of these, you're actually impacting 2 or more. And we use that term conflict. It means that, for example, if you're running late and the time cannot be changed, you might need to bring in more human resources to still deliver on time. But the problem with that is if you bring in more human resources, you're going to effectively increase cost. So you're going to impact both human resource management and cost management. And of course, I know you wouldn't do this, but some people bypass the testing. And therefore they'll say, no one will know, we just won't do the tests. And of course, tests come under quality management. So again, the rule is if you mess with one, you're impacting 2 or more. So when you look at it, if I bypass the test, which is under quality management, I'm effectively increasing the risks. Of course, integration management also includes things like the actual methodology itself, all the templates and everything you use, but the key one there is the project management plan. And some organisations have 2 different versions of it. They may have a simple plan, which provides the basic rigour for simple and small projects compared to the complex project or major project that has to have a full suite of all the key tools. So project management methodologies per se integrate everything we need, and particularly the project management plan is a core focus of integration management, which includes the change management process. Because at the end of the day, if the project needs to be altered in terms of the scope, we then have to go through a formal change management process and get that approved before we make the change and update the project management plan. So in summary, when you look at this, projects are really about people. At the end of the day, you can have all the processes in place, you can have all the scope defined, etc. But if you're not focusing on the relationships, things can go wrong. In fact, even the technology projects, those ones that fail, that don't see the end of the day, researchers indicate around 90-95+% of those actually have technology solutions. So where are the issues? It all comes down to people and politics. Hard to believe, isn't it? But at the end of the day, as a project manager, you have to improve your people skills. Of course, the systems, the process, the methodology, all those things are there because process guides behaviour. And if you don't have that as a boundary, people then go and do their own thing. You create lone rangers, people that are going to cause chaos. Whereas a methodology, a project management methodology, provides that standardisation so we can do the same approach to projects through all projects within that organisation. That means that if one's succeeding, one's failing, we've got a better idea to identify what was the difference because we're using the same process. Of course, remember, change one knowledge area, you're impacting at least 2 or more. So that's a good way to memorize, or good reason to memorize, the 10 knowledge areas or functions of project management, because if you mess with one, you're going to be messing with two or more. And therefore, if you're at a meeting, you can provide more feedback and input when you're considering what else is being impacted.